I'm so glad that you're here. This is our fourth tour of the orchestra presentation in partnership with the Terre Haute Symphony Orchestra and OLLI at ISU. I'm really excited to introduce to you our Associate Principal Cello, Philip Kettler. This is his third season with the Terre Haute Symphony Orchestra. If you were present at our November 7th concert just this past Saturday, he was performing with the symphony. For those of you that are season ticket holders, we do have a recording of that. We are putting it together as a final edit this week and should have a link to you to a private YouTube video this week. The concert went really well, so I'm very glad you're able to join us today. Philip, it's all yours.
Hi everybody, can everybody hear me okay? Good. Well, yes, as Sammy said, my name is Philip Kettler. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about the cello, which is, of course, my favorite orchestral instrument. Those of you who were able to come to the concert, the Terre Haute Symphony concert this weekend, saw that the cello was featured by my colleague Sung-Ah, who played a concerto and a really nice encore for the cello. So for the rest of you that didn't see that, I have my work cut out for me. Telling you why the cello is the best instrument in the orchestra. Really quickly, just to introduce myself and my upbringing with the cello, if you watched the previous presentations by my colleagues the last few weeks, you learned that students who play wind and brass instruments will tend to start those instruments when they're a little bit older, usually around 5th, 6th, or 7th grade. And I think that's because the mechanics of those instruments and what you have to do with your mouth is just a little bit too difficult for somebody who's really young. But string instruments are quite different, and students start when they're very young. I started playing the cello when I was 4 years old. And so even though I am not particularly old these days, I have already been playing cello for decades. And I'm incredibly thankful for that because in all honesty, I don't really have memories from my life from before I was playing cello. So cello has really been part of me and who I am and who I've become as I've grown up. The cello's always really been with me, I've been incredibly fortunate for that. I grew up in I was born in Washington, D.C. and grew up in the area. I was going to start playing the violin because all 4-year-olds want to play violin when they start music. And so my mother took me to our local community music school in DC, and they reminded us that all 4-year-olds want to play violin. So there was a 2-year wait list, and the school was the one that said, there's no wait list for the cello. Why doesn't he play that? And I don't think I really knew what the cello was, so I just said whatever, and my mom said sure. And that's how my journey with the cello began, and I am incredibly fortunate that it happened that way because I think that I like the cello a lot more than the violin and that it's a lot more me. I did my undergraduate studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. For one semester of that time, I studied abroad at the Conservatory of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And then when I graduated from Vanderbilt, I stayed living in Nashville for a little while, working as a freelancer, doing orchestral work and also a lot of Nashville studio soundtrack recording work. So recording soundtracks for movies and video games and TV shows, and also for recording albums for local Nashville artists, which was a real blast and a really fun thing to do, especially when I was 22 years old. And then I moved up to Indiana to do my master's at IU in Bloomington, and now I'm working on my doctorate at IU in Bloomington. So that's sort of a very short version of my journey. And now to move on to the cello, which is why you're really here. The cello is part of the violin family of instruments, which comprises the violin, which is the smallest one, the viola, which is a little bit larger, the cello, and the double bass. And it's easy to think of those 4 instruments corresponding to the 4 voice parts that you would hear in any church choir or school choir. So the violin is sort of the soprano, the viola is the alto, the cello represents the tenor, and the double bass represents the bass voice. Of course, the ranges of these instruments are a little bit larger than the range of of human voices. So you'll hear later that a cello can actually go quite high and even sound like a soprano sometimes. The violin family of instruments came about around 1500, the year 1500. We don't know exactly when, but we start seeing treatises and articles being written about these instruments around the year 1500. And at that time, the cello had a very, very specific role in music and in the violin family, and that was pretty much entirely as an accompanimental instrument, playing bass lines. And these would be to accompany solo instruments that were higher. So that would be like the violin or the flute or the oboe or, of course, the human voice. So the cello, for a long time, filled that accompanimental role and not a soloistic role. And it lasted that way for a long time, almost 2 centuries. And in this period, which sort of started in the Renaissance and moved into the Baroque period, the cello was right at home in this group called the basso continuo instruments. And in music, the basso continuo line is the line that, like I said before, would accompany solo instruments. But the basso continuo was not a specific instrument, but rather any grouping of instruments that could be accompanimental. So usually a group of basso continuo instruments, depending on the piece, could include a cello or another bass string instrument like the double bass or the viola da gamba to play the bass lines, and then an instrument to fill out the harmonies, which was usually the harpsichord, which was the predecessor to the piano, so a keyboard instrument, or a strummed string instrument like a lute, or a theorbo, which is like a larger bass lute. So yeah, the cello didn't really exist as its own individual instrument for a long time. It existed in this basso continuo context. If you think about in like a modern jazz big band today, the rhythm section, of course, all those instruments individually are really important, but the whole rhythm section, the bass and the piano and the drums, they really all have to be there to make it work. And that's kind of how the basso continuo section was back in the Baroque period. The cello didn't really have any kind of solo music until the beginning of the 18th century. In the 17th century, there were some solo pieces written for the cello. I think most notably, we have the Ricercari for solo cello by the composer Gabrieli in Italy. But these pieces were very, very simple. Monophonic, meaning just one simple line, pretty much all in the lower bass register, and not exploring much of the cello's range. So that's what music was like for the cello in this. Not nearly as virtuosic or expansive as music for the violin or those higher solo instruments. But at the turn of that century, going into the 18th century, is when we started to see some real solo music by quite famous composers that we all recognize today. Of course, Vivaldi, the great Venetian composer, wrote he wrote tons of music for every instrument, but he wrote lots of sonatas and concertos for cello, really putting the concerto in the front of the orchestra, featuring it as a solo instrument. And then, of course, most famous works from this era, and perhaps our most famous works for the cello ever, which you'll hear a little bit of later, the Johann Sebastian Bach solo cello suites, which Bach wrote in the 1720s-ish. Again, we don't know exactly when, but it was sometime around that time. And these pieces were absolutely revolutionary for the cello because they featured the solo unaccompanied cello as an incredibly virtuosic and versatile solo instrument. They didn't just use the lower range, but covered the whole range of the instrument. They were not just comprising, bass lines and lower lines, but they were quite polyphonic, actually, which means that there were multiple voice parts going on, being played just like the cello. I mean, these pieces much more resembled violin pieces from this time. And so the fact that they were written on cello was really quite revolutionary. And in fact, no solo unaccompanied pieces were written like this really until the 20th century. So these pieces remained our main solo unaccompanied pieces for hundreds of years. After that era ended, the Baroque era, so this is turning through 1750, the classical era, this is when the cello started to be recognized very broadly by lots of composers as a real solo instrument. And the early classical composers started to write lots of cello concertos and cello sonatas. Very notably, we had J.S. Bach's own son, C.P.E. Bach, wrote a set of 3 cello concertos. Other classical composers like Luigi Boccherini, who himself was a virtuoso cellist, wrote 9 or 10, lots and lots of cello concertos, and really made it his mission in life to feature the cello as a solo instrument and put it at the front of the orchestra. Lots of other famous...
Interrupt you for just a second.
Uh-huh.
Anybody else got a frozen screen?
Oh,
Oh, yeah. Philip, I guess your video
Yes,
froze.
I do.
Hearing you perfectly.
oh gosh.
Yes.
I can see all you guys fine.
Let's give it just a second and see if it'll.
Yeah.
Or try turning your video off and then turning it back on.
That would work too.
I was just listening to the great history and wasn't even paying attention to the video. Oh, there you are.
Move. Okay. Awesome.
That worked. Thanks, Philip.
Can you guys see me there?
Yep.
Being able to see.
Okay. Sorry about that. I guess those are the faults of Zoom that we're all dealing with. So anyway, the classical era was a great time for cello. Those of you who heard the concert on Saturday, this last Saturday, you heard one of the Haydn cello concertos. Haydn was one of the greatest composers of the classical era. And he wrote 2 fantastic concertos for cello, one of which was played on Saturday by the Terre Haute Symphony. So these pieces are still incredibly popular. And so, yeah, by this time, so late 18th century into the 19th century, the cello was incredibly popular. We also know that famous composers like Mozart wrote cello concertos, although we unfortunately don't have the music for them. There is no music for the Mozart cello concertos anywhere, but we, and when I say we, I don't mean me, I mean scholars, have copies of Mozart's journals in which he wrote, these are the favorite passages that I wrote from my cello concertos, and here's a section from my second cello concerto, and things like that. So we know that these pieces are out there, we just don't have them. So after this, if you guys will all check your attics and basements, sometimes pieces come up in people's attics. So that would be great if we could find some Mozart cello concertos. I think that when people think about the cello today and their favorite music for the cello, they think about music from the Romantic era. I think the cello is very closely associated with the Romantic era because of the cello's beautiful, deep tone and its singing tone. So by the time the Romantic era came about, so we're talking mid-19th century, composers were writing very large-scale, important pieces for the cello. So Beethoven was writing 5 sonatas and sets of variations. Brahms was writing 2 sonatas. Composers like Dvorak and Edward Elgar wrote huge cello concertos, incredibly beautiful. Camille Saint-Saëns in France. So the cello was, at this point, basically in front of the orchestra as a solo instrument at the same level that the violin and the piano were. And the violin and piano have always kind of been the most soloistic of the classical instruments when it comes to concertos and things like that, sonatas. But the cello was working its way there. In fact, there were some composers that only wanted to write solo pieces for the cello. Most notably, the composers Chopin and Rachmaninoff, which, I mean, those two are 2 of the greatest composers of all time, but certainly of the Romantic era. And they were famous for their piano pieces, and they wrote lots and lots of piano pieces. But both of them also wrote solo music for the cello and only the cello. Chopin wrote 1 cello sonata and 1 cello concert piece, both of which are among our absolute favorite pieces to play. And Rachmaninoff also wrote a cello sonata. and none of them wrote solo music for any other instrument besides the piano or cello. In fact, there's a story of a violinist approaching Rachmaninoff and saying, "What's the deal? Can you please write some violin music so I can play it?" And Rachmaninoff said, "Why would I write for the violin when I can write for the cello?" So composers of this time really knew that the cello could achieve really amazing and beautiful things. So the rest from there is history. Of course, now the cello exists everywhere in classical music as a solo instrument, in chamber music, in the string quartet, solo unaccompanied music, orchestra, and I could talk about all of that forever. So that's a little bit about how the cello came to be from its original accompanimental status to the status where it is today. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the instrument itself and the parts that make up an instrument. I understand that I'm the first string player to talk to you, so I will talk about this, and pretty much everything that I'm talking about on the cello will also apply to the violin and viola, and double bass for that matter, because they're all built pretty much exactly the same, just in different sizes. But of course, the cello has some things that are unique, so I'll talk about those as well. So first and foremost, the most important part of the cello is the body of the instrument. The back of the cello, the sides, the neck, and the scroll up here are all always made by the same type of wood. And most commonly that wood is maple, because maple is a very hard and sturdy wood. And so in the earliest days of the instruments, you saw lots of maple-backed cellos. And this cello that I have is also made of maple. The top, also a number of other woods were used for the backs and sides and neck and scroll. Most popularly was poplar and willow. So maple, poplar, and willow were very common to make cellos. And then there are some modern makers alive now that are also making instruments out of aspen wood. But I think that's a little bit more niche. So you're pretty much always going to see poplar, willow, or maple. The top of the cello is always a different type of wood and is always spruce. And the reason that it's always spruce is that spruce is a little bit of a softer wood, and it's very important that the top of the cello be able to vibrate a lot to make the sound. And I'll talk about how sound is created in a little bit. But I know that this is a screen, so it's harder to see, but you can tell from looking at this that the grain of wood here and this grain of wood is very different. This maple has these large sideways lines like this, whereas spruce has really fine vertical lines like this. If you see a poplar instruments are beautiful because they're very swirly, like the wood on poplar swirls. So it's really, once you kind of know what the woods look like, it's really fun to look at people's instruments and try to guess what types of wood they're made of. But maple and spruce are absolutely the most common. And the famous instrument makers that were making instruments in the 16th and 17th centuries, if you've heard of the Stradivarius family or the Amati family, that made kind of the golden age of instruments, they were all spruce and maple. So that's the body of the cello. On top of the neck, we play atop the fingerboard. The fingerboard is made of ebony, which is an incredibly hard, solid wood, and very heavy too, because we are playing on top of this fingerboard all the time. So this is made of ebony, and ebony is incredibly naturally dark. So some ebony fingerboards that you see are in fact not painted at all. They are just naturally the color that you see. They're this dark. So that's the fingerboard. Modern cellists play with an end pin, which connects the cello to the ground. This just helps us kind of stabilize our instrument so we can play it a little bit more comfortably. My end pin is made of steel, but end pins are also commonly made from carbon fiber, which is much lighter than steel, and also copper and brass. So you could get a cellist talking about the material of their end pin and why that makes their cello sound better for a long time. But this is a steel end pin, very standard. Up here is the tailpiece. Now the tailpiece is wrapped around the end pin here. So it's not glued or attached to the cello in any kind of way other than the fact that it is tied around the tailpiece here. So it's hanging loose. You can move it. And then the tailpiece is where you attach the strings, which you then tie with the pegs, or you screw on with the pegs. So again, the strings are not glued or attached in any way to the instrument other than the fact that they are tied to the tailpiece and then wrapped around these pegs up here in the scroll. And all of this tension and pressure holds on the bridge. The bridge is also made of spruce, and you can not really see through the camera, but the grain of my bridge matches the grain of my cello because they're made of the same wood. And again, the bridge is not fastened or glued to the cello at all. It is simply held down by the pressure of the strings and the pressure of the tailpiece. So there is a lot of, this is all screwed on very tightly. There's a lot of pressure. Now it's screwed on tightly enough that the bridge isn't going to move when you're playing it, but you can move the bridge with your hands. So everything is very fragile. But this design, which is very ingenious, I think, is the reason that string instruments create this really amazing natural acoustic sound. So basically how the cello produces its sound is that we play a string and the string vibrates, and it vibrates like crazy because it's really long and there's lots of tension on it. So the string vibrates and the tailpiece vibrates as well. And that makes the bridge vibrate. Now the bridge is made of a soft wood, so the bridge vibrates a lot too, which then makes the top of the whole cello vibrate like crazy. I can feel it with my hand that the top of this instrument is vibrating a lot when the strings are vibrating too. Then the most important part of the cello and of every string instrument is the sound post, which you can't see. The sound post is just a stick that's about the size of a nickel in width for a cello. It's smaller for a violin, but it's about the size of a nickel in width and connects the top of the cello to the back, and it sits right about here below the bridge. So you can see it if you look inside the holes, but there's a wood stick attaching the front to the back. Again, it is not glued in there, it is fastened in there. And when the cello is vibrating and the top is vibrating, that makes the sound post also vibrate like crazy, which then makes the sound and all the vibration hit the back of the instrument, and then once that happens, the sound forms in the instrument and comes out of the F holes here. So that all happens extremely fast, and every piece is incredibly important. It's important that everything is there, especially the sound post. If your sound post is there, your instrument is going to sound terrible and make a very weak, very unflattering sound. So that is a little bit about how these instruments are set up, and they've changed a lot over the years too. So end pins, which we play on, are a product of the 20th century. So for hundreds of years, cellos didn't have end pins, and in fact, cellists just comfortably rested the cello on their legs like this. And that's how the cello was played for a really long time. The end pin was eventually developed because when your cello is resting like this, it's not particularly sturdy, and it can be a little bit difficult to play. But the end pin, which is extremely common now, and everybody has one, actually, when you look at the life history of the cello, is somewhat new. Also, many pieces on the cello used to be made from different materials. So my tailpiece, you can probably see it shining in the light. This tailpiece is made of plastic, actually. And I know it seems a little weird to have something made of plastic on your fine wood instrument, but actually tailpieces, you want a tailpiece to be really, really light so that it's incredibly reactive to your motions. So tailpieces today are made mostly of carbon fiber and plastic, although some people use tailpieces made out of wood. And of course, back when cellos were invented in the 16th century, tailpieces were made of wood almost entirely. The other most significant difference between a modern cello and a cello back from the olden days are the strings. Strings today are made of metal. My strings are made of steel and tungsten, and because of that, they can withstand a ton of pressure, and they're really, really loud. So a solo cellist can fill up the sound of a gigantic concert hall because of steel strings. But before strings were made of metal, they were made of gut. Most often sheep gut, but also sometimes cow gut, that were wound together really tightly and just put on a cello unwound. And the sound of gut strings is really special and really beautiful, but gut strings are a lot more feeble than metal strings, so they cannot withstand very much pressure. So they tend to die a lot sooner than metal strings. And they also just are not nearly as loud. They don't have as much tension as metal strings, so they're not as loud. So you can hear people today, myself included, play on period-style instruments with gut strings, and you can hear them. And they're really, really beautiful, but it's a much different sound if you're used to hearing what a modern cello sounds like, with metal strings and a very reactive plastic tailpiece and a metal end pin. The other most important part about the cello is the bow. So the bow is a little bit more simple. This part of the bow where we hold is called the frog. We have a screw here where we can tighten and loosen the bow. And then we have the stick of the bow, and we have the hair of the bow, which is the hair from a horse's tail. So most hair that we use when we play is white hair, but some players also use black hair, which is less common. But if you look at an orchestra, you might see some players playing with black horsehair. Bows are always, always made of Pernambuco, the type of wood, Pernambuco, which is a wood native to South America, and actually most commonly the Amazon, which is a really interesting problem today for modern bow makers, because it's quite difficult for them to get their hands on Pernambuco, because Pernambuco, I think, is restricted in a lot of ways. It's endangered. So it'll be really interesting to see how bow making might change. I think makers might have to start making bows out of different types of wood. But all bows now are made of Pernambuco. Pernambuco is incredibly flexible and also incredibly strong. So your bow, no matter how much pressure you're putting on it, it's never going to snap, but it's always going to be able to bend. This bow that I have is the modern bow, which was developed in France in the 19th century, this style of bow, not my bow, but this style of bow. And you'll notice that what's significant about this bow is its shape. It is convex, I want to say, where it's bent down like this. It's convex. An early bow from the Baroque period, which I own one of, is shaped in the opposite way. It's concave. This is what the original bows looked like. And what a bow like this does is it puts all of the weight and the strength of the bow here down at the frog, which means that the tip is very, very weak and very, very light. So when you play something on the Baroque bow, it is almost always going to decay like that. You don't get a lot of sustain with the Baroque bow because of its shape. And because of that, music from this time reflects that. Baroque music is very light and has lots of air. It often has lots of air and lots of space in it. And that is because string players were playing on bows like this. the big development of the bow in the 19th century was to change its shape and make it bent like this. And what this does is it puts lots of strength and lots of weight here at the tip. So now the weight of the bow is much more evenly distributed. When I draw a bow with my modern bow, it is able to sustain all the way through. Also, you're able to use lots of power at the tip. So if you're doing an up bow, there is lots of power there as well. And this is also a reflection of the music of its time, because this came about in the Romantic period, and when we think about Romantic music, we think about music that is very sustained and luscious and made up of really, really long phrases. And that certainly helped that they had bows like this. I think this kind of brings up that chicken or the egg question. You know, did composers start writing music like that because they had bows like this? Or did bow makers make this bow because music needed a bow like this? I'm sure that somebody knows the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's really fascinating how just a slight change in the shape of a bow can really affect the way that it plays and the way that it sounds. I am going to play for you a little bit. The last thing I want to talk about with the mechanics of the instrument is just the tuning. The cello is tuned in open tuning, meaning open intervals. So every note is a perfect fifth above the previous note. So we have a low C, and then a G, a D, and then an A. All string instruments are tuned to perfect open intervals like this. The violin and the viola are also tuned to perfect fifths, and the violin has a high E string above the A, so it sounds like this. And a bass is tuned in perfect fourths, but still in open tuning. So, yeah, I think different string instruments, like, for example, the guitar or the banjo, are tuned in all kinds of different intervals. The banjo, is tuned to a closed major chord, and a guitar is tuned to a combination of perfect fourths and also thirds. So, yeah, that's the tuning of the cello. And now I'm going to play a little bit for you guys before we go on to questions. And I'm going to sort of break my playing into two segments. The first segment is going to be famous solos that you might hear from the orchestral repertoire. So in the orchestral setting, if you go to an orchestra concert, it's very, very common to hear a solo by a woodwind instrument or a brass instrument or the violin, the concertmaster. And cello solos are a little bit less common, but I think because of that, they're extra special. And so there are some really, really great orchestral cello solos, and I'm going to play 3 of them for you guys. And I'm going to move my microphone so it's closer to my cello, and I'll try to speak up so you can still hear me. So this first solo that I'm going to play is by an Austrian composer named Franz von Suppe. And he was a Romantic composer, and during his lifetime, he was very well known and very celebrated for his operas. People don't really play his operas anymore. His popularity has certainly dwindled, but the overtures to his operas are still incredibly popular, and orchestras play them all the time at the beginnings of their concerts. So the Overture to Poet and Peasant, which is one of his operas, features a very, very beautiful cello solo right at the beginning. So this is the cello solo from Poet and Peasant Overture by Franz von Suppe. So the next solo I'm going to play is a very, very different solo written by the great Soviet composer Dimitri Shostakovich. Shostakovich was well known for writing lots and lots of music. He wrote 15 symphonies, which is incredibly prolific for that time. But in his very, very first symphony, he wrote a huge cello solo in the fourth movement. This piece was written when he was 19 years old, and some famous composers we know wrote music when they were that young, and we think of their music from that time as being less mature and less developed than their later music. But I think right away from his first symphony, when he was 19 years old, we learn that Shastakovic is going to be an incredibly mature composer, and is going to live a very tormented life, which he did. This symphony is incredibly loud and bombastic, and the fourth movement is no exception, but all of a sudden the entire orchestra drops out, and there is a very, very exposed, very fragile and vulnerable cello solo, which I would consider to be the climax of the entire piece. So this is the cello solo from the fourth movement of Shostakovich Symphony No. 1. So the last orchestral solo I'm going to play for you guys is by Richard Strauss, the wonderful, very late hyper-romantic German composer. Strauss was known for composing very, very large pieces, huge operas, big orchestral tone poems for a gigantic orchestra. Some of you might remember that a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the Terre Haute Symphony, we played the Strauss Death and Transfiguration piece, which is an example, I think, of his standard piece. It's huge. This next solo I'm going to play, though, is for one of the very few pieces he wrote for a chamber orchestra, so a much smaller orchestra. This is an orchestral suite called Le Bourgeois Gentilom, pardon my French. And the final closing scene is titled The Dinner in the Ballroom. And it features this very lovely cello solo, which I think kind of just wraps up the piece in a really nice way. So this is the last orchestral solo I'll play for you by Richard Strauss. So those were 3 solos you might hear if you go see an orchestra concert. I'm just really quickly going to play 2 solo cello pieces that you might hear if you attended a solo cello recital. The first one is by Rachmaninoff, who I mentioned earlier. This piece is called Vocalise, and I specifically picked it to play for you all because I think it showcases the cello as an incredibly beautiful singing voice. Oh, this is something I was going to mention before. The cello is very often associated, the sound of the cello is very often associated with the human voice. In fact, scientists have done studies where they measured and mapped sound waves from every single instrument. And in fact, the sound waves from the cello most closely match the sound waves of the human voice. So I think this piece by Rachmaninoff really showcases that. It's called Vocalise. And after that, I'm going to play a piece by Bach from those Bach cello suites that you might recognize, the prelude to the first suite. So after that, I will open it up to questions, but really quickly, here is Rachmaninoff and Bach. So that concludes my little concert, and I would love to hear from you guys and take questions if you have any.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Philip. I loved your interpretation of the Bach. It's so nice to hear that piece with somebody else playing it, that, you know, because everybody, that piece is so played so often. It's really nice to hear just different interpretations of it.
Yeah.
I have a few questions in the chat, so we'll work our way through those questions.
Yeah.
And then if anybody wants to unmute their mic after we work our way through the chat questions, we'll do that. So our first question from Gretchen, she's asking, I would like to ask for an overview, care, and maintenance of the instrument. So what do you do to care for the cello?
Oh, that's a great question. So the regular everyday maintenance mainly is composed of taking care of the strings. So the horsehair, which we play the strings with, we have to make stickier with something called rosin. And rosin is made of tree sap. So we brush rosin onto our bow so that we can grip the string and play the string. But what happens then is that rosin, that sticky rosin, stays on our strings, and that can really disintegrate your strings and make the life of your strings be much shorter. So it's very important that whenever we stop our practicing or performing, immediately with a cloth, I just wipe down my strings to really make sure that rosin is all off of there. That'll make my strings last a lot longer. Also, this might not necessarily have to do with maintenance, but it kind of does. The bow has a screw that you can tighten and loosen. And so I just loosened my bow, and you can probably see that it's bent a little bit more and that the stick is closer to the hair. That is how we make our bow when we're not playing it. We tighten our bow so that we can play it and it has strength. But if we leave it tightened all the time, it'll wear out the screw and it'll wear out the wood of the stick. So it's also very important every time we pack up, we loosen our bow. I mean, other maintenance things come up as they do. I'm actually going to my cello doctor later today up in Indianapolis because my bridge needs a little bit of an adjustment. We have to change our strings every 6 to 8 months, and we also have to replace the hair on our bows. It eventually wears out.
The wheel came off of my
Yeah, and so also about every 6 or 8 months, we have to take our bow into the shop and have a bow maker put new, fresh horsehair on it. So that is, I mean, there's a lot more. Cellos and wood instruments are very temperamental to the weather.
No,
and
garbage can.
so my cello was starting to acclimate to the cold weather, and then it got hot again.
is that?
So it's a little bit whacked out. The pieces of the cello are glued together, and the seams can open, which is not good. That makes the cello sound really, really bad and make a buzzing sound. And it's also can damage the structural integrity of the cello. So you have to be very aware of your seams becoming open when the weather changes a lot, and you have to take it into a shop and get them glued shut again.
You guys keep humidifiers in your case?
Some people keep humidifiers in their case. I do not. I've been advised against it because when you keep a humidifier in your case, your cello is extremely humidified when it's in the case, and then when you take it out to play or rehearse, you're drastically changing the humidity. Some people keep what are called dampits, which are little sponges that you can actually put inside your cello in the F-hole. Some people, I don't do that either. My cello adjusts to the weather okay. So I don't do much, but some people do. And honestly, I mean, we want to avoid those open seams, but an open seam is actually not very bad because that means that things are moving and they didn't crack. Because if a seam needs to move and it doesn't open, then it could crack. And a cracked piece of wood is the worst. So while an open seam is a little scary, exactly. So while an open seam is a little scary, in the grand scheme of things, you can get it fixed, and it's a much better fix than repairing a crack. So
yeah. All right. Next question. Actually, this is more of a comment from Sherry Daly. She's on our board. She said, you know, the cello always sounds so mournful. Are there any pieces that are less tragic? But then she comments, oh, the Bach was less mournful.
Yes. The cello can be very, very mournful, but it can also be very uplifting. Lots of movements of Bach. Bach wrote lots of dance movements, which are very, very uplifting. Those of you who were at the Terre Haute Symphony concert on Saturday heard the C major cello concerto by Haydn. Which is also very, very uplifting. So yeah, I think the cello has a really, really broad range of sounds that it can make.
Absolutely.
I'm glad that you noticed that.
True. Okay, next question. Would you demonstrate the difference in sound from playing the same note at different positions on different strings?
Sure. That's a great question. So the longer our string is, the more it vibrates. And so when we play a note and we are playing it in a lower position, that means the string is longer. The distance between our finger and the bridge is longer. So that longer string will make a louder and brighter sound. So if we have this C, this is just middle C on the piano. If we play this on the A string, we're playing it with a pretty long string in a low position, so it'll be very bright and very loud. We can play that same note on the D string, but if we play it here, our distance between our finger and the bridge is a lot less. So the sound is a little bit more subdued. I don't know if you can hear that through the mic.
I can at least, yeah.
Good. Well, that's good. Yeah. And you can even play that same note on the upper string. So G string, that same C is here. Now we're playing with quite a short string. So that creates a different tone. And then if we play it on the C string, it starts to get a little bit muddy. The strings also get thicker as they go down. So our thinner strings will be, again, brighter. And our thicker strings will be a little bit heavier and make a little bit more of that rounded sound. Some other examples. Some pieces utilize that really well, and a composer will write the same note to be played on a different string, so you can really hear a tone change. One example is by the composer Grieg. that kind of goes on like that. But he intentionally wants you to play that same passage on the D string the second time, so it's a little bit more.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah, that was a great question. Okay, next one. What type of pieces did you have to play for your Terre Haute Symphony audition?
That's a great question. So usually on your standard orchestra audition, you have to play a solo piece, which is usually a concerto, and then you have to play a selection of orchestral excerpts that feature your instrument. I know that when Sammy did hers, she played some famous clarinet excerpts. So for me, I played a concerto by Schumann, one of the great Romantic composers, and then I was provided with a list by the Terre Haute Symphony of orchestral excerpts that I had to play. And the most standard ones, I don't remember exactly which ones were on the Terre Haute list because it was a few years ago, but the really standard ones are the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, the Mendelssohn Midsummer Night's Dream. Also, I played some Strauss earlier. We have the Strauss.
I was going to say, I think Don Juan is on the cello.
Don Juan was probably on there. So the Beethoven 5 second movement excerpt sounds like this. There are also excerpts by Tchaikovsky that we play, by Verdi, and I would play more of them if I felt comfortable that I could play them well for you guys. But yeah, so basically usually there's a solo piece that you are allowed to choose and then a list of standard excerpts that they choose for you that you have to prepare. So it's kind of nice. You get to pick your own thing, but also you don't have to pick everything.
Right. Well, and I think for the symphony, David Bowden always asks for unaccompanied Bach as well, in addition, typically for string. So for everyone at home, he would have played like the Schumann and then the Bach piece, the cello sonata that we all know and love, and then he would have played orchestral excerpts as well.
Yes. That I thank you for reminding me of that, Sammy.
Yeah.
Yes, Maestro Bowden asked me to play some Bach, which is a little bit less common in orchestra auditions.
Mm-hmm.
But some orchestras do also ask to hear some Bach. So
yeah. All right. Next question. This is a popular question in all of our sessions. How much does the cello cost? And then I'll add to that, how much does the bow cost? Because I know that's always surprising to me.
Yeah. That's a great question. Especially for string instruments. And there are some different categories that we can get into. String instruments are incredibly expensive. I mean, when you're starting, you can get a starter cello that will do what you need to do for $1,000 or $2,000, and that's fine. But once you want to get into the professional level of instruments, you're going to pay a lot more. I mean, the kind of intro professional level is around $20,000 to $25,000, and that will get you a modern instrument that's pretty solid and quite good. My cello that I play was made in 2018 in Chicago, so this is a modern American cello. And living makers are making really wonderful instruments. So believe it or not, getting a good cello for $25,000 is kind of considered a steal in this field. I think I did pretty well. The really famous modern makers make instruments sometimes that go up to $50,000 or $60,000. Those are really famous makers. Like, for example, Yo-Yo Ma has a modern cello that he plays. And that maker's cellos cost much more. Another difference is that with string instruments, you get into the antique market. Something that's really remarkable about string instruments is that they don't get worse over time. In fact, they get better. So people today are playing on instruments from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. My teacher from IU plays a cello made in 1707. One of the other cello teachers at IU, who's also the cellist of the Pacifica Quartet, his cello was made in 1590, I want to say 8. So it's really amazing and remarkable that people are still playing these instruments. Those instruments, however, have antique value. and are incredibly expensive. So German and French cellos that are old like that are usually a few $100,000. Like a Viome, which is a very, very sought after French cello, would be about $300,000. And for whatever reason, the Italian instruments are like the holy grail. And fine old antique Italian instruments that have a big name and can be authenticated as being real, excuse me, usually are going to cost above $1 million. Like, so if you have a Stradivarius cello or an Amati or a Guarneri, these are big Italian names. Those cellos are usually between $1 and, I want to say, $4 million. The Stradivarius that Yo-Yo Ma plays, for example, has been appraised for around $5 million. There are some violins that are around $10 million. And there are lots of factors that go into that. Their condition, also who played them in the past. I mean, the reason Yo-Yo Ma's cello is so expensive, among other things, is that it was also played by Jacqueline Dupre, one of the greatest cellists of the 20th century. So also just knowing that a cello that you had might have been played by one of the all-time greats is something very special.
What about the bow?
And the bows are incredibly what some might consider to be overpriced as well. A kind of intro standard good bow is going to cost you around $3,000 ish. And then I'm actually trying bow. I'm bow shopping right now. So I'm borrowing this bow from a friend. This is his bow. It's not mine. I wish it was. So a really great professional level modern bow is going to cost between $7,000 and $10,000. And then again, we get into that antique field. So the greatest bows, greatest instruments are Italian. The greatest bows are French. So if you play a great French bow, like a Tort or a Picat, you might pay between $20,000 and $40,000 for a bow. So if you're a top tier performing artist, world-class soloist, you might have $1 million cello and a $40,000 bow, which is amazing. The last thing I'll say about this is that people that play expensive instruments like that, people that play string instruments a lot, in fact, don't own their own instruments because it's quite impossible to own a $5 million cello sometimes. Even Yo-Yo Ma doesn't own his cello. It's owned by a foundation that loans it to him. Mm-hmm. Lots of famous soloists play instruments that are they're on permanent loan, so it's like they're theirs, but they don't own them. So a lot of the most a lot of the most famous and expensive instruments in the world are either owned by a private donor, like a wealthy donor, or a foundation that loans it to us.
And actually, our concertmaster of the Terre Haute Symphony, Daniel Eisenstadt, does not own his violin. It is owned. That's right. Yeah, he won a competition, and he plays on one of those violins that is quite expensive, and it's owned by someone in Israel, a foundation. Yeah, so maybe next week when we have the violin, Toby Elser, who's a violinist, will be joining us. We'll talk a little bit about the violins, and maybe we can go into Daniel's violin just a little bit. So
yeah, Daniel plays an old French violin. You're right.
Violin, yes, yep. Okay, a couple more questions for you from Betsy. She asked, do you play in any other orchestras?
I do. So in addition to being associate principal of the Terre Haute Symphony, I am the second cellist, the assistant principal of the Indianapolis Chamber Orchestra, which is a little bit more regularly performing orchestra than Terre Haute. We have concerts pretty much every other week, not in COVID times. Usually we have concerts every other week. So I live in Bloomington, and so my most usual schedule is splitting time between Bloomington and Indianapolis. And I'm also the acting principal cellist of the Carmel Symphony, so up right north of Indianapolis. We actually have a concert this weekend. And I also play in the Huntsville Symphony in Huntsville, Alabama, which I was down in Huntsville last weekend. So, yeah, I also sub with a number of other orchestras in the region and outside the region. So, yeah, pretty standard freelance orchestral situation I have during non-COVID times when concerts are happening much more often, I'm pretty much every week I'm in a different town playing with a different orchestra.
All right, and then last question. Oh, let's see. Let me make sure this is the last question. Yep, last question in my chat here. In the TV series, Mozart in the Jungle, the cellist has tendinitis. Is that typical? Are there physical hazards and injuries that come with playing the cello?
Yes, there certainly are. Tendinitis is a good example, which players get. I thankfully have never suffered from tendinitis, but I have dealt with shoulder problems and actually finger problems. Twice in my life, I have ruptured a nerve ending in my fingers, which means I was overplaying and over pressing down on the strings, and I ruptured the nerve endings in one of my fingers, which shot pain into my body and hurt a lot. And I had to, of course, take a big long break from playing cello. So there are lots of things we have to work with that are specific to the instrument. Cello players deal a lot because we have to be sitting down when we play. Most other instruments have the option to stand when they play, but we are always sitting. So cellists deal with back problems pretty significantly, which happen when they're older. Every cello teacher that I've ever had, and I wish this was an exaggeration, but it's not, my high school teacher, my undergraduate teacher, and my teacher at IU have all undergone pretty major lower back surgery, which were all results of, a lifetime of cello playing. So I think it's just, when we're playing, we have to be really conscious of our posture, that we're not leaning and putting all this weight on our lower back. And we have to be careful that we're not overworking ourselves to get things like tendinitis or that nerve ending thing. Everybody's different. So, I know that some people deal with problems with their hands and their wrists. I haven't had that, but I have bigger muscle problems like shoulder and back. So yeah. Good question.
Okay. Norma, it looks like we're seeing your screen. Would you mind stop sharing your screen? You'll just go up to the top of your screen and there should be a stop share button. I'll see if I can request control, maybe.
I am trying. I don't even get in there. It's not even allowed to do it, but.
That's okay. All right, we got one more question while you were talking, Philip. How are you getting back and forth to Huntsville? Are you driving, flying, and then how do you transport your cello?
Yeah, so good question. I drive to Huntsville. Huntsville is actually in the very, very northern part of Alabama, so it's actually only a 6-hour drive from Bloomington, which certainly surprised me that you could get from Indiana to Alabama in 6 hours. So I do drive to Huntsville, and I drive to gigs, but bringing up traveling and flying with a cello is a great, great question, because obviously a cello is too big to put in the overhead compartment. So cellists fly with extra seats, and they put their cellos in the seat next to them.
You actually have to purchase an extra ticket for your cello.
Yes. So you have to purchase a ticket. Thankfully, I am at the point now in my career that when I fly, people that are flying me pay for that extra seat. But yes, somebody has to buy a full-priced extra seat for the cello, because a cello is much too fragile to check as luggage for two reasons. The most obvious reason is that luggage handlers are not particularly sensitive, and even if you put a fragile sticker on it, they might, throw it down there. And also, luggage compartments in airplanes are not temperature controlled. So usually they are as cold as the air around them. So usually your luggage in an airplane can get down to negative 30 degrees, which is way too cold to put a wood instrument inside. There will be terrible things will happen. So yes, I do fly. I sometimes play with an orchestra in Florida, and I travel to do solo and chamber music concerts pretty regularly, and I fly, and yeah, I fly with my cello, and I won't get into what that's like with the TSA, but it's
During one of our presentations, we'll have our double bass principal, Brian McNally, come. And when double basses travel, or at least the ones that I've known, they usually have some kind of almost could survive a nuclear war type case that they put their double bass in, because they have to go under the plane. And so these things are temperature controlled. It's like a steel case, essentially.
And it's like 300 pounds. Those things are amazing.
They're unbelievable. Yes. Betsy Frank just commented a long time ago, she knew somebody that was on a plane with Yo-Yo Ma and his cello.
Amazing. Yeah.
Pretty spectacular. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, excellent. Does anyone else have a question for Philip? I have a question for you. Just, you were talking about end pegs and the different materials of end pegs, and this is kind of similar to clarinetists and the material of our ligatures, and how gold versus silver versus nickel versus bronze, whatever, can change the sound of the instrument. So how, I know you're not much into the end pegs, but how do other players say it changes the sound?
That's another great question that is also not specific to the end pin, but also applies to the tailpiece and the bridge.
Okay.
So cellos have characteristics, and they tend to naturally be very bright and loud, or maybe more on the darker and warmer side. So we need to pick our accessories to complement that and bring out where it needs help. So metal end pins, like steel and brass end pins, are not particularly loud for the sound, but they create a real warmth. So metal end pins are warmer rather than louder and brighter. And players that play on carbon fiber end pin, carbon fiber is incredibly light, and I used to have a carbon fiber end pin, and it weighs like, half a pound. Those are loud, but they don't add a lot of depth to the sound. So this cello is a modern cello, and it's naturally kind of bright. So I use a metal end pin because that kind of warms up the sound. The end pin not only vibrates the cello, but it vibrates the floor. Cellists, when they perform solos, will often sit on a box.
Yeah, if anyone was at the concert on Saturday, you noticed that Sung-ah was raised. She was actually sitting on a podium.
Yes. And that box is hollow. Not only does, you do that to be a little bit higher so people can see you, but that box acts as like a miniature amplifier. When you stick your end pin into that box and you play, that box all of a sudden is vibrating like your cello is vibrating. So a steel end pin will carry that vibration a lot more than a carbon fiber end pin because it's heavier. Same thing goes with tailpieces. I mentioned different types of tailpieces. Some people use wood tailpieces because they are warmer and richer, and other people use plastic and carbon fiber end pins, tailpieces, because they are brighter and lighter. So I actually have an interesting combination where I have a dark, warm end pin, but a bright tailpiece made of plastic. And then also there are two types of bridges. There is a French bridge and a Belgian bridge. And there are differences that you can see if you look up close, but the main difference is that the Belgian bridge actually is just a lot less wood. So again, it's a little bit brighter and louder, whereas a French bridge is more wood and creates more of that deep and resonant tone. So it's a lot of fun to mess around and change things to see how it'll affect the sound of your instrument. My cello, I bought, like I said, my cello is modern, and I bought directly from the guy who made it in Chicago, which is really exciting. And so he knows this instrument better than anybody, and so he set this instrument up in the way that he thought was best, with this metal, plastic, and Belgian bridge. But perhaps one day it'll be fun to get a brass end pin or a wood tailpiece and just...
Sure. Oh, yeah. Clarinetists can go crazy with mouthpieces and bells and barrels and ligatures.
And strings, of course. Also, of course, strings. Strings have all different types of brightnesses and warmths. I'm playing on a pretty bright set of strings now that I don't love. I think when I get new strings, I'll pick a slightly darker set.
Speaking of, how much do strings cost?
Oh, another good question. Professional level strings cost, a full set costs between $275 and $350.
And how often do you change them?
It would be ideal if we changed them every 6-ish months, but you can push it. I'm pushing it right now. So you can sometimes go 8 or 10 months, and then we also have to get our bows rehaired. And rehairs are not very expensive; they cost about $75.
Okay. Betsy Frank, who has also asked me the same question. She asked, "What is your dissertation topic?"
Oh, I wish you hadn't asked that because I haven't. I am only in the second year of my coursework. So I have not chosen a dissertation topic yet. I am currently enrolled in this course called Doctoral String Literature, which is an independent study. And in that, I kind of like a mini dissertation, sort of. I just picked any topic and I worked through it with my teacher. And I am studying a topic which is called scordatura. Scordatura is an extended technique for string instruments where you tune the strings to different notes. So I talked about tuning and these perfect fifths. There are actually quite a bit of compositions that require you to tune your strings to different notes, which drastically changes the sound of your instrument. I am playing a piece right now where you actually tune your 2 lowest strings lower than they normally are. So all of a sudden the cello becomes even lower and creates this amazing this piece is in B minor, so now I have a low B string. Yeah, so that is this little topic that I'm exploring right now, why composers did that, when they started doing that. But I don't know if that'll be my full dissertation topic.
Yeah.
TBD. So good question.
For those who are joining us, there's a really famous piece you all would know, Danse Macabre, with the violin solo at the beginning. That violin is tuned differently. And the few times I've played this piece, the concertmaster typically has an entirely separate instrument that's already tuned, and they switch instruments so that they can play Danse Macabre and then pick up another instrument and play whatever else is on the program.
And I played that Bach for you all. There are 6 Bach cello suites. The 5th one is written for a cello with a different tuning. You are supposed to tune the A string down a whole step to a G, so you have 2 G strings. It creates an amazing timbre.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a
so
cool thing
interesting.
Instruments can do.
Okay, Sherry, this will be the last question. Let's see. For those of us who love Mozart's Clarinet Concerto,
great piece.
The notion that his concerti for the cello has been lost is painful. Agreed. Has anyone tried to create a cello concerto from the notations in his journals?
That's a good question that I don't entirely know the answer to. I know that what we have from his journals is not a lot. I mean, it's truly a little 2-measure snippet or something like that.
Right, it's not even almost a full melody.
Yeah, the most famous one is that there's a score from one of his string quartets, and we do have the full score for that piece. And he writes, "I love this second theme. You know, this was the same one for my cello concerto." And so we know we have ideas, but I think we don't quite have enough material to completely work with. There are some famous pieces in the repertoire that are unfinished that people have finished. A famous one is Schubert's 8th Symphony,
or the Lachrymos from the Mass.
Of course. Oh yes, of course.
Yeah.
Also, for example, the Dvorak Cello Concerto. There are actually 2 Dvorak Cello Concertos, and the second one he only wrote. Yeah. No one plays the other one because he only wrote the cello part and a piano reduction. He himself didn't write the orchestra score. So there is somebody else made an orchestral arrangement of it. But I think in those cases, there was much more material to work from. You're right that it is very sad that we don't have those Mozart concertos. Also, we play 2 Haydn concertos, and we know that there were probably at least 2 more Haydn concertos. So we're very lucky to have the 2 that we have, but hopefully one day we might have 2 more.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Philip. I learned more than I can imagine about the cello. I had no idea about the Baroque bow. I thought that was so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If anyone has any additional